Today, we have two extraordinary subject matter experts with us, and we're going to be discussing labeling and how it impacts healthcare products and why that's so important to design. Labeling is often neglected, and it can really impact your design and design experience. So, we're going to dive into how. My name is Rae Davel. I have a background in product design, and I'm a design researcher here at Veranex.
Thanks. I'm Talitha. I'm a design researcher in our London office, and I have a background in industrial design engineering, graduated from Delft University of Technology 2 years ago.
And my name is David Copeland, and I'm a director of human-centered design with Veranex in the Minnesota office. And I'm a graduate of Carnegie Mellon University all those years ago. So I'd like to introduce our two guests and have them talk a bit about themselves. I'd like to talk to Susan McDonald and Jimmy Wong. And Susan, if you don't mind going first, please.
Sure. I'm Susan McDonald. I'm Director of Human Factors and User Research. I've been with Veranex for about 8 years. And my background is human factors. I studied at Tufts University, have a degree in human factors from there, and a master's in engineering management from Northeastern.
Fantastic. And Jimmy Wong, would you mind introducing yourself too?
Sure, and thanks guys for having me. I'm Jimmy Wong. I've been with Veranex for about maybe 11 years now. So my background is design. I went to Syracuse University. I'm product design team here, but I mainly specialize on doing instructions for use, labeling, and packaging. But also just for the listeners, my journey here across the 11 years really started in research, maybe the first 3 years before I got into doing instructions for use.
So that interest of yours is a great segue into why we're talking today. Because in healthcare, the packaging of devices and medications is not merely a vessel to transport it from A to B. It helps the user in understanding what the product is, how it should be used, but it's also a means to mitigate usability risks and create a successful user experience for our users. So most importantly, labeling of medical devices is a communication tool that requires robust information design. So what we see often, funnily enough, is that information design of a product's labeling is an undervalued topic left to the last moment of a project, meaning that opportunities to build a positive relationship with the product's user right from the start of its use, they're missed. And more critically, usability risks are left behind for the user. So, Jimmy, I'm curious, being the first thing that people see of your product, what does labeling really mean for you, and how do you unlock those opportunities for a better user experience?
Really great question. So yeah, when I think of labeling, I think it means so much more to me than a lot of other people in the industry, because I think, yeah, I agree. I think it's kind of an afterthought. People spend so much time developing the product, and then, I think that's natural. They want to focus on that. So they don't really think of the instructions when they get to the end. And, I think the instructions, or overall in general, labeling, packaging, I think it's kind of like the whole other half of the product design, where it's, you get to present the product to the user. And I think it's also one of the first touch points for that engagement for the user. And, I really think of labeling as like, this might be hard for some to hear, but I think it can make, a bad product, a not so great product, better, and maybe a good product great, because I think I think it helps introduce the users to the product. I think people can and will use things wrong, even if it's a really intuitive product. And I think, developing labeling is kind of like, ensuring everything goes according to your plan. And also just thinking about the user, creating that experience for them instead of just kind of dropping something, in front of them and just expecting everything will go well. I think it kind of like really embodies human-centered and usability, because it's thinking like, oh, if I'm going to give this to somebody who's never encountered this before, like they might not know what to do, or they might kind of be caught off guard. Creating an overall well-labeled packaging experience kind of helps ease that entry in, creating that relationship with the product, stepping in through the door. And then once you see the instructions, it's kind of like, oh, great, I like there's something that I could go to and help myself along to get, familiar with this. And if it's great instructions, people don't really even know. They just kind of start using it and they're like, wow, that was really easy. But I think if you have bad instructions, a bad product experience, people really notice that. And from the get-go, I think they just end up fostering or building kind of like a bad impression of your product. I mean, we're all familiar with like Apple products. I think these are the details, and I think that's why people miss them. But if you spend a little bit of time on them, then you can kind of create a packaging experience. You could cater an experience. So it's like, yeah, here's a nice box. It helps kind of set the tone or the personality of the product or the device. And then you go into it and then you get the instructions. And the instructions kind of, again, it just kind of helps gradually ease you into more and more kind of like engagement level. And good instructions, we've all seen bad instructions, or I think I think it's culturally, society, like, or at least, Western culture, and probably predominantly in the US, I would say. Sorry, I guess we have a bad reputation. I think we just generally all expect instructions to be bad and not want to deal with them, but it doesn't have to be that way. I think good instructions can, really engage users, even if you're the person who never reads instructions. But I think it could excite, but really good instructions, I think, can excite people and give them a good product experience, walk them through, using a product. And then finally, the product. I think just all adds to the experience of the product. I think, again, if you have poor packaging, poor instructions, I think it just creates a poor product experience. Regardless of how good the device is, it just makes that learning curve more difficult when it doesn't have to be. It's not just the device. I think the product is the overall experience. What it comes in, the packaging, the instructions, or I guess the usability and instructions ends up being part of that. And when you have a bad usability experience, then that's the overall like bad product experience. It's not like just bad instructions, but great product. I think the two are, the whole system all share the same, experience.
I agree, Jimmy. I think it's a complete ecosystem, and it should all be considered as part of the use of the device. I feel like packaging, as others have mentioned, is that first introduction to a device. And the instructions, all of the parts of that, the packaging, labeling, and information system, are opportunities for you to shake the user's hand in a friendly way and have them have just a really pleasant use experience. So rather than think of it, I think others have mentioned that it is an afterthought. It's like make it an integral part of your design.
We have to do instructions and packaging, but I think if you approach it as, an opportunity and put, your best effort in it, you can really create a really complete holistic product experience. And I think it's going about it and just kind of like treating it as like a check off the box. I think it's leaving a lot to chance is kind of how I think about it. I think it's like we spend so much time developing the product, these last final touches that could derail the entire kind of like intended, we all have excitement and are proud of the products we create. But we just like, do we really want to put in all that effort and then at the end kind of not do the same amount of effort for the labeling? I mean, again, I think other people they've said to me that it's like, oh, in some ways, instructions are just as important as the product. Without good instructions, it does have a chance, people use the product wrong or they make errors, they make mistakes. And that's a lot costlier than just putting in some effort and trying to make good instructions that help you mitigate those errors. Because I think all of us in the medical industry, we all know like how costly errors and mistakes could be, whether you're the manufacturer or unfortunately, if you're the patient or the healthcare professional, it's like it could be really, damaging or costly.
So you're saying that there are some people who recognize the value of the labeling and packaging. What would you say to the people who say, "Oh, it's just packaging, it's just labeling"?
I still want to say it's not just that simple because it really isn't. For the people who are able to kind of like see their product go into user testing and then or eventually also see their product go through, filing and submission with the reviewer and what the reviewer is paying attention to, I think that's really then you see it's not just labeling or packaging. If you see it more as, oh, these are things that could help you avoid use errors, mitigate risks, help the users in the usability testing or in the real world use your product more correctly, therefore more successfully, versus the opposite, creating more errors and using it wrong and potentially getting hurt. So it is kind of like it's not just, if you do look at it as just, it doesn't just happen as, oh, whether you have it or not, instructions. But if you have bad instructions, you might actually be encouraging or, facilitating an experience that might have more use errors or more harm. But if you have good instructions, good product experience, you might be going the other end of that, spectrum where you're facilitating and encouraging better use and avoiding use errors and harms. And therefore, if you want to see it as just for the end user, yeah, we all don't want harms. But if you want to see it as, the business-minded angle where it's like, hey, can you really afford to have your product's chance of getting to market derailed because you're going into testing and you're getting all these errors and you're demonstrating that the product is not safe to use, when in actuality, maybe it was, but do you really want to leave that to chance? Or do you want to just, on the other flip side of the coin is just put in a little bit of effort, develop these instructions, and give yourself the best chance to create, to really highlight and show how well your product could be. I don't think it's just labeling or just a check off the box kind of a deal.
Jimmy, one thing I want to sort of add is around the idea that packaging or labeling isn't touched by users and user studies until validations frequently or till just before the validation. So I would say that does happen quite frequently, but we do have lots of other opportunities for touch points with end users that we conduct expert reviews or early formative testing. And I want to encourage all developers and designers to really get those early instructions out in front of people. And that really can, drive that design. I know, Jimmy, you have tons of experience with inheriting sort of either poor information design that you then are asked to fix when we're prepping for a validation. That's just, kind of a fire drill that could have absolutely been avoided. It's unfair to you, but it's also maybe you could have, driven the design in a different direction. Instead of having to inherit maybe a format or, structure that you wouldn't have done if you had it from the ground up, for example. So I would just encourage people to, test early and often have, early prototypes that you want to try.
Yeah, Susan, that is so true. Yeah, like labeling, we think it's just you developing it, it's at the end. But yeah, the earlier you could do instructions, I think it actually, especially if you just treat it as a check off the box kind of thing, then you're already approaching it without a lot of meaning. But if you actually think about it, writing instructions for use, I guess, what I mean by like treating it as like a check off the box is like, don't go about writing instructions as just a matter of fact, like, this. I think sometimes people have a tendency to do that. But I think if people go about it, developing instructions and thinking like, oh, this is a piece of communication. There's an audience on the other end. And does this make sense to them? Like, is this the right message? And is it at a level that they could receive and understand? Because then that really puts you in like human factors usability kind of a mindset. And to your point, Susan, yeah, like the earlier you could, you're thinking about instructions or developing them, oftentimes like once you start writing it that way, you start realizing that maybe that feature that you developed on the device, maybe it's not that intuitive because maybe the way you're writing it, it's like, do this, then wait for this, then do this. But it's like, why can't that just be simplified down to, one step? That happens a lot in instructions where it's like, whoa, like, I thought I was describing how to do one step, but it sounds like it's 3 steps. So, sometimes we go back to the engineers and we're like, hey, maybe, that aspect, that feature seems a little kind of confusing or hard, or maybe they might do something wrong. Can we actually rethink about how we do that action? The earlier you do it, you're more able to respond to these scenarios and, change the develop or make tweaks to your product. Sometimes if you're doing this so late in the game that your product's already defined, it's kind of harder to make those changes. And then you're just kind of leaving everything on the shoulders of labeling to kind of address those. And sometimes labeling just, it has its limitations. It can't solve everything. And that's also recognized by a lot of the regulatory bodies. Like labeling doesn't completely get rid of risks. The only way you could really do that is through physical device design by completely designing out the potential for, making those errors. Because I guess like an extreme example of why labeling can't completely do away with errors is We've all done it before. Some of us don't read instructions and we just open it and we toss them out, and it's never going to get its chance to do anything. Or if instructions aren't used, then they have no value. But once they're used, that's kind of where the power of them come in. And so I guess instructions are great, but I think it's also, when I'm out there doing instructions, I try to make them well enough that, even if you are somebody who thought you didn't read instructions, but if it kind of presents itself in a manner where it's like, hey, this really isn't going to take a lot of your time. It's really, or really not that inconvenient. It's going to be really low effort. We've seen a lot of users in usability testing get converted, and they're like, wow, I didn't know instructions could be this useful. I should really start reading instructions and, paying attention and looking at these more.
I agree, Jamie. I think it's a bit of a chicken and egg that if you have poorly designed instructions, you're more inclined to discard them. If you have well-designed instructions, then maybe it will engage you even more and encourage you to use the device correctly. So I would look at it as, again, it's an opportunity to augment your use instead of be that Band-Aid that fixes a poor design. I mean, I know labeling can be a tool that helps when there are kind of those moments of like, shoot, we do have this, use error that we didn't see before and we're really far along development. How can we possibly manage this? And so labeling can be there, but I would encourage you to consider it also just as, again, something to augment your design instead of be that Band-Aid.
Yeah, definitely do instructions earlier as soon as you can, and definitely involve human factors, usability researchers. When you're starting to develop that product, involve them as early as possible. They're definitely your allies. Put it in the heavy lifting early on is just going to save you a lot of heartache later on.
I'm curious now, you already gave a bit of a flavor of how you work with your clients on information design. Yeah, I would like to know a bit more whether there are steps, for instance, that recurrently lead to complexity in those programs. So what we've seen in practice sometimes, for example, is that in nursing stations, products are removed from their original packaging so that they can be stored all together in a drawer, and they keep one eye view at the front of that drawer. However, this means, of course, that in most cases, the person using the product in the end would not be the person opening up the packaging and unwrapping it in the first place. So they wouldn't see all the information that they might need or be expected to see before they start using this product. So, Jimmy, could you tell me a bit more? What are clients usually surprised by in the labeling process, and what aspects do they maybe often forget or neglect when they're starting out?
That is a very real challenge to labeling, because it's like once we get separated from the product, like how do you get those instructions back in front of people? Good instructions will actually cause people to be more likely to save them. I think what happens is poor instructions, people kind of like put them away and forget them. But I think good instructions are the ones that made an impression on people. And especially if good instructions could be like really easy to consume, or they were just so short that it was really convenient and fast to consume. So think quick reference guides, like people love those. But, in a hospital setting, teams have binders full of instructions that, nobody really knows what's in them or when's the last time they looked in them. But I know instructions are really easy to use and make an impression on people. Members actually want to share that with other people, or it's like, they get excited about it, where it's like, oh, you haven't used this before? Like, hey, don't worry, there's a really easy instructions. Like, let me go get that for you. Like, they remember. Definitely some of it's also accessibility, which I think regulatory bodies also do a good job, where it's like there are places that you can go and access instructions through web links. And then, now we're also seeing QR codes, YouTube videos, other ways of getting instructions in front of people. I think the best and most convenient way, still in my mind, is, paper and quick reference guides, and especially the instructions that make a really good impression on people. They're just easy, handy, and available, and they can only be that way if, people actually remember and want to save them and refer to them. But, the poor ones, they'll just get tucked away and forgotten about. They'll find themselves at the bottom of the drawer. For clients, I think oftentimes, again, it's that check off the box kind of mentality, where they think it's just, I have to have instructions, but they're not really thinking of it as like an overall experience, because maybe, yeah, you do have your IFU, but maybe it's also like, here's an opportunity for a quick reference guide, or maybe here's an opportunity for some on-device labeling, that can help kind of also give you cues directly on the device and make that feature more intuitive to operate. So there are a lot of like, I think putting yourself in the whole kind of end user's perspective of like how they're going to receive this and go about using it, and using it as well as the client. The client, clients and the developers, we're so familiar with it that we're not walking into it naive. But for an end user, they really don't know, let alone know where to begin, but they don't even know what's in front of them. Thinking about how you could create that product experience, cater and walk through that, how this product gets, what it is, how it's used, and what to expect. Labeling sure has a huge part in that, but I think a lot of it is this whole getting into the mindset of, the end user, human factors, and usability. So I think that's a little bit of a surprise for clients, you know, which, I guess I can't blame them because there is a lot to manage when you're developing a product. Don't forget the end user. Ultimately, you're creating something for somebody to use at the end. And if you're thinking about them, it's not just a product. Again, it's a overall product experience that people are they kind of go about it where they're like, oh, that was easy to use. Oh, I like this product. I'm not afraid to use this product again. Like if we think injectables, a lot of people are afraid of injections, but we've definitely seen in studies before that sometimes a really good product experience just kind of breaks down those barriers, and they're like, oh, I wish all like injectables were this easy to use. But sometimes in actuality, like that injectable might not have been different than, the other injectable. I think it's just people's, expectations, and good packaging, good labeling, good product experience kind of helps people step into those expectations and know what's going to happen. And again, I guess bringing it back to the client, a lot of these labeling things, they could be solutions to your problems or problems that you might not even knew, that you had. I guess it's not problems that you didn't know you had, but it's kind of like obstacles. There are barriers or challenges along the way, usability testing, whether you can demonstrate something gets, people are making errors or they're not and they're using it well. Like that's an obstacle. That's a challenge that you have to, along your product development, come in front of. So I think if you're developing these instructions and you look at it as like, hey, good instructions are going to set me up better, that when I get in front of that specific task or test, it's going to make it go, it's going to give it, better chances of occurring how I want it to go or how I intended it to go. So I think when clients start viewing these things as solutions to potential obstacles, suddenly those clients have a greater appreciation for the stuff. They don't see it as, oh, the instructions are just instructions. They look at it as like, hey, that step, it was a little bit confusing. Is there ways that we can kind of make it simpler and easier to the next time we come back in front of that step? I think sometimes like, yeah, a designer is making those instructions for you, and we have a tendency to think of design as like, oh, design's just pretty. But I don't see it that way. I think design is really it's just a tool. I think of it as taking a back seat where I kind of just look at, there are problems and challenges, and those problems are like, this product has 10 steps. There are 10 steps it could possibly go wrong at each step. So let me help you make sure like we're crafting the right messaging, we're crafting the right picture diagram, and we're presenting all of these instructions in a way that is easy to, receive and consume, understand, comprehend. We're putting on a flow that makes sense. And, we're trying to meet the user at their level. And so I just see it as problems and solutions, and design just happens to be the tool that we're using to create those solutions. Oftentimes, I think that's the part they get surprised about. There's actually a lot more to this than just a designer making pretty pictures. There's a lot of strategy driving towards outcomes that we want.
Fantastic. Great summary there, Jimmy. I do want to ask a question pointedly. You give a great perspective of how design, factors into labeling creation and the importance of not ignoring it. But I want to get Susan to chime in too. So thinking about, why should, labeling or considerations and design of labeling not be neglected, right? What do you see from your perspective?
Sure. As I mentioned before, really see it as that way to hold the user's hand through those potentially challenging steps. I mean, through all the steps, but it gives them comfort. It's a wayfinding tool, and it's one of those things that is an afterthought. It's a missed opportunity. It's a shame because you're, getting to the device, getting to that use of the device can either start you off on a negative path or on a positive path. So I just really see that as such a key part of the holistic use of your system. Something that Jimmy said made me think through this as well, that I think he touched on a really important point, which is understanding that end user context and the whole use scenario. I think, Talitha, you mentioned that too, with the nurses in the drawers and the instructions there. And it's really, you can't think of these things or design in a vacuum. And I know our team doesn't do that, thankfully. So they are thinking through the whole experience. It's not just the perfect box on a bench that's clean with perfect lighting and walking through the use of the device. It's okay, this end user's in a reprocessing department. They're going to be wearing protective gear and maybe something over their face, and it's going to be wet. And maybe the lighting is not going to be task lighting. It's going to be ambient fluorescent lighting. The designer needs to take all of that into account and think through, like, okay, well, maybe I need to create a quick reference guide that can be taped to the wall along with other instructions found in that department. And it needs to withstand water, and it needs to be in large enough font and with enough contrast so someone can read it at a distance of 3 feet or 4 away from where it's held. And thinking through it like that. And in the nursing station context, it's okay, maybe on the outside of that box, we don't place key important information. Maybe we make sure either on the device itself, or maybe it's a quick reference guide that can hold the subsequent devices like together. So you make sure if you pick up one, it comes with that instruction. So you just enable the user to do the right thing. If you want them to use your device correctly, you want them to take a peek at these instructions, and you want them to, think through the use case and be reminded of the things they're supposed to do.
Susan, you kind of mentioned something really interesting there too, and we've seen it firsthand also, where it's like we've been a part of programs where it's like, oh, they're using this in the OR suite, and the instructions aren't going to make it in there. But like, hey, what if it was on something kind of to your point, where it's like, waterproof, or it can get sterilized, and therefore it could make it into the sterile field, so that the it's not something taped across the room on the wall, or somebody trying to like read and play telephone and communicate it back, and then the message is lost. But we've also seen having good instructions, whether it can make it right into to the user, whether that's surgeon in the sterile field, or just really good instructions that help users understand the product between just them and the seat, might also help some clients reduce the amount of service reps they need in field, or training personnel in the field, especially now when maybe things are harder because of having to do things virtually, or people can't travel because of the pandemic. Good instructions might also help you save where opportunities where it's like, hey, maybe I don't have to create that video that's also going to cost me so much more, because the paper instructions are already, that good. We've definitely seen clients that have reaped a lot of benefits from the instructions beyond just we're used to, where it's just making them and then going through the product testing. And I guess even on another way, it's like sometimes it helps them differentiate and stand out from the competitors who might have really bad, instructions or bad product experience.
Jimmy, I was thinking too that you've used the opportunity of maybe a peel pack, and that peel away part is your instructions. So it's been sterilized, or it's been sterilized, or it's right there at the point of use. And so the user can really reference that. But we've also experienced where we've gotten to studies and there's a kind of oh shoot moment where the instructions aren't sterile, and you have someone outside of the sterile field holding up the instructions, and obviously that's less than ideal. So having to kind of go back and do something that's less than ideal is really not where you want to be, and that's why you want to do that earlier testing.
Yeah, there are a lot of great designers and engineers out there who might say like, hey, can we stick a label here? Can we print on the Tyvek? Can we include an insert card? I think for a lot of clients, they have the product, and then suddenly now they have to think about the whole product experience. Like, is it a kitted product versus just a product in a box? So the product development doesn't really end. I feel like there's a whole other part of it where you still have to develop the product experience.
Well, a question for you, Jimmy, and Susan too. You talked a lot about sort of the process and expectations and needs and everything. So if we take it back a little bit, why would someone want to contact Veranex about this? What kind of expertise or exposure do we have, or ability to kind of help navigate this space? So if you tell us a little bit about why Veranex, I'd be intrigued about that.
I think we have a lot of experience creating labeling and instructions for use and thinking about usability, the overall experience, product experience. Just because we have so many disciplines, we're not siloed or inaccessible to each other. I think every single program we're a part of, there's somebody from every discipline or somebody we can go to. So I think there's a lot of history that if a client is considering us, that they could lean on, you know, all of the disciplines that we have here, and also all the programs that everybody here has worked on, previously. So we're not just looking at your product as like the first time it's being done. Like, an example could be like an injectable. Like, we've done so many injectables before that, we're able to see, we're able to know what has worked and what hasn't worked. So you can kind of get there faster. I think another way is it's not easy to collect all these experts or different backgrounds and disciplines together. I'm not just saying that as somebody at Veranex, but saying that as just as a designer. So much of what I do, I don't do it alone. And I really enjoy being able to go to my colleagues or colleagues that are available to me, researchers, human factors engineers, regulatory. I don't think I would have ever kind of gone out and exposed myself or learned that. And I don't think I could learn those perspectives on my own. So being able to have access to those people and go to them has definitely helped me over the course of my time at Veranex be effective at doing labeling in the medical field. Everybody here strives to inject that into every program.
I love that, Jimmy. And I love to add to it too, to say you're just a prime example of the depth and breadth of experience that we have. It's the number of instructions that you've worked on and the different types of labeling and packaging that you've pulled together for clients is just unparalleled. And it's not just you, there are many folks like that. So I would say it's Veranex's just deep knowledge in the space, in the medical device and diagnostics space and in combination space as well. And I would say that because of that experience, there's not any one of us that would just take requests at face value. So for example, if a client came to Jimmy and asked for instructions, he would, stop right there and say, I need to have a bunch of questions answered, and maybe they can be answered in order for him to do his work. But also he knows to lean on other experts, other designers, human factors engineers, design researchers to find out the information he needs to create the best product for the client. So I just would say that's a Veranex difference.
Fantastic. Thank you.
So you've really highlighted the benefits of treating labeling with importance and doing it properly, how that can impact the user experience and even the work of the team and making things go faster and turn out better. Can you tell us about an instance where labeling wasn't treated with the proper amount of importance and when things kind of went bad?
Every time a product comes in front of me, I'm always thinking about this is how the developer described to me how it's used. And then me and like a usability researcher or human factors person, we kind of like to put our shoes in the end user and think, well, how is this really going to be used by somebody? And sometimes when I'm in that mindset and thinking about it, I'm like, okay, I can see where areas of the product could be easy to use and areas of the product where it could be difficult and maybe people would stumble and lead to errors. And sometimes in those instances, it's like I would think, okay, can labeling solve that? Can it help kind of clarify that and then guide people down the right path? But there are limitations to it too. Labeling can only explain or do so much. It's just a aspect of the product that's too difficult. Usually in those instances, then it's like we'd like to go back to the engineer and say like, hey, can we redesign this part of it? Now, when they can't, I guess that's where it goes bad. We think we just keep revising. It must be the instructions. We just keep revising the instructions and eventually we'll arrive at the right instructions. But, that could be a really drawn out, lengthy process. Sometimes we just don't have all that time and luxury and budget to keep revising instructions and going down that path. I think we don't expect it to go that long, but sometimes it ends up being that way because we're only looking at it from the angle of the instructions. Like we're only willing to update that. But sometimes I think there are instances where clients they eventually have to come to grips that it's just like, hey, there's a part of your product design that is just not user friendly. And the only way to solve that is to design out what's wrong with the device. It's a hard truth. And I know people they want to do everything to kind of avoid it. But I would say that's the extreme example of just drawing out the length of coming to that realization, when sometimes if you could just put in the effort earlier, like in a really good example, oftentimes we've seen a lot of those clients who are like, hey, I don't want to leave everything to chance. Let's do everything we can and to the best we can. A lot of those clients end up seeing like, oh, they might have planned for 3 studies and they were able to finish in 2 studies, or they thought something might take, whether it's studies or regulatory review time, they planned for maybe like a year or 2 years, and they've seen that time, reduced down to 75% or 50% of that time, or not get stuck with regulatory reviewers as much because maybe they didn't have as much to come back to you and tell you to fix, because you yourself were trying to think of all the possibilities and try to just address them ahead of time instead of just leaving it to chance. It could either go really bad or it could go really well. I know a lot of our clients who decide to put their best foot forward. There's so much more to be gained in the examples where, the programs or, clients that don't want to go that extra effort. I think it's unfortunate they eventually at the end, I think if they had a chance to look back on it, they were like, oh, I went through a lot of struggle, or, didn't really have to go through.
Jamie, one example I'm thinking of that you were much closer to than I was. I was only peripherally involved, but a client came to us thinking they were ready for a usability validation. And really what I think it was in the pilot study that we recognized that the unboxing experience and the lack of kitting design, or the poor kitting design, meant that the end user wasn't getting to all the parts they needed to get to, and they weren't using them in the correct order. Correct me if I'm wrong, Jamie, but I feel like that's a great case study of how the client didn't consider that unboxing experience and it affected usability study, and then you had to pivot.
Yeah, it's all, again, thinking about the end user or the product experience, because I think once you put yourself in that mindset, then you're like, oh yeah, how is this going to go? Like, what happens first, second, third, instead of here's a product, figure it out on your own. We really try to help clients see the entire picture and let them decide.
Today we spoke about the importance of those good instructions and good labeling, as well as the challenges it can bring with it when developing it, and finally the benefits you can reap for creating a good user experience. But this is just the beginning of our roundtable series of Veranex, because we're a company of multidisciplinary experts in healthcare, from designers to human factors engineers to market access and beyond. So we're excited to continue these conversations with our subject matter experts across the company and continue bringing their experience to you through these podcasts.
Jimmy and Susan, thank you guys so much for showing up today and providing your insights and your experiences. We hope to get the chance to speak with you both again in the future. But until then, goodbye for now.